All right. Welcome to Colorado Real Estate Exam Prep. And guys, what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about the Colorado forms and contracts. Now, what's important about this is it's 23 items. So 23 of your quiz questions at the PSI exam are going to be around Colorado forms and contracts specifically. And so if we were to look at this is kind of what it drops into. So here it is, 23 items. We're going to talk about the listing contract and buyer representation agreements. And there's a little bit of confusion around this because at the end of the day, listing contracts can be both buy side and sell side. So it gets a little confusing. They're all listing contracts, but when we break it down, say buyer representation, it's a little bit easier. Contracts to buy and sell, which includes the new disclosures. And guys, that's the agreement between the parties when they're purchasing the property. We're going to talk about the use of standard forms, the deed of trust versus a promissory note, disclosure documents, addenda to the contracts, counterproposal forms, closing instruction, and seller financing. So if we look at this, what we know is this. On the state exam, there's 74 questions. And out of that 74 questions, you have to get 53 of them correct. Well, 23 of them are these Colorado forms. So we're talking one third of your entire state quiz is around this one section. So that's all we're going to focus on today. Like we are just going to dive into this, and this should be a little fun. What we're going to do is we're going to hit a section. We're going to look at a slide, and that slide, we're just going to kind of break it down. So like the first one's going to be listing contracts. So we're going to talk about it. We're going to have a brief little teaching session around it. And then from there, I'm going to show you some like potential questions that you could get around that and give you the explanation as to why it is the answer. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to start on this thing. We're going to jump into it. And here we are. So Colorado forms and contracts, 23 questions, state prep, and the first topic, listing contracts and buyer representation agreements. So in Colorado, a listing contract is a legally binding agreement between a real estate broker and a buyer or a seller that defines the terms and conditions of their relationship. So when they're talking about listing agreements, representation agreements, the parties to that are the agent and the client. All right. And so it also could be like in a transaction brokerage relationship. And so everyone just, so you understand, in the state of Colorado, you can have an agreement, right? The exclusive right would be what we'd be talking about. So the exclusive right, and the exclusive right could be broken down and it can say either agency or transaction broker. All right. So you can have this agreement in place. And also what we just have to know is if you don't have a signed agency agreement in the state of Colorado, you are by default a transaction broker. Very important to know. Both for practical purposes as well for this exam. A buyer's agent agreement, also known as a buyer representation agreement, is a contract between a buyer and a real estate agent that outlines the terms of their working relationship. So for the most part, when we're talking about this quiz, contracts are pretty much designed for like the sell side of things. They're talking about the listing agent and they're talking about the seller. Now, we do have buyer agency agreements, and so they're probably going to differentiate it by actually spelling out buyer's agent on the exam. So just kind of default always to the sell side of things. You also might get a question around like a co-op. All right. So they might actually say co-op. Well, again, everything is catered to the sell side. So if they're talking about the co-op, they're talking about the buyer's agent. All right. So when you're looking at these different questions, just always picture yourself like this, everything was designed to be on the sell side. So you're representing the seller, you are the listing agent. And when they talk about like a co-op or something, they're actually talking about the buy side of things. So they'll actually spell it out. The contract is entered into by the buyer or seller with a real estate broker. And this agreement will set forth the type of brokerage relationship that will be established between the broker and the client. It will also set forth the brokerage services to be provided to the client, the compensation to be paid to the broker for those services rendered, as well as many other terms and conditions to the client and broker that they are agreeing to in this listing contract. And a very important provision in this document includes the duties that the broker must perform on behalf of the client. So if we're entering into an agency agreement inside of the listing agreement, then we have a client, right? We know that a client we have a fiduciary relationship with, and that is going to outline how we are to handle this relationship and like what we're going to do. So let's look at this thing. So here's two questions around the listing contract and buyer representation agreements. And it says, a property is being listed by a broker associate. The employing broker requires that all listings use an approved listing contract form that provides the brokerage firm with the maximum protection. Which form should the broker associate use? And so, guys, this is a very real question. I can almost guarantee you that every one of you is going to get this question. It might not be word for word, but it is this question. And if you're looking at this, you see these two things, right? And so it's definitely an exclusive right. All right. So it's either got to be A or D. And they're going to line this question up just like this. And so you're like, it's an exclusive right, Charles, for sure. And you're going to check A. And D is actually the right answer. All right. So an exclusive right to sell listing ensures that the brokerage firm will be paid regardless of who sells the property. The exclusive right to buy is used to establish a buyer agency agreement. So, guys, this is set up just like a very real question that you will see on the exam. All right. Very real question. I can guarantee you that you're going to see a question around what type of agreement has the most protections for the agent, and it's the exclusive right. Well, the way that they set this one up is they wanted you to jump on the exclusive right to buy when in all reality it's the exclusive right to sell. So be cognizant of that. They will set you up to jump on the first thing that you recognize, and they're going to bury the real answer. So whole construction of this question, very real. Your second question, the listing contract on Maple Avenue has expired. Prior to the expiration date, the broker gave the seller a list of potential buyers who had seen the property in compliance with the 60-day holdover listing. 3 months later, the seller sold the property to one of the buyers listed. In this case, what? Well, like we're looking at this and we're deconstructing and we're saying, okay, cool. We know that the listing has ended, but prior to the listing ended, there was a holdover clause in here, and we actually gave the seller the buyers, right? Like we were like, here's your list. Like we're in compliance. Like we did everything we did right. And so we're looking at these answers, and I'm hoping no one chose D. But if you did choose D, I understand why you did. We got to deconstruct this a little bit more. And it says the broker, it's A, will receive no commission. The broker would have had the right to be paid if the sale had occurred within those 60 days. So, like, we're looking at this, it's giving us all the information. It's pointing us in this direction that we believe, like, oh, yeah, like there's a holdover. We're getting paid on this. We followed all the rules. We gave the list. We did everything. Well, the holdover was only for 60 days and it's 3 months later. Like we have to go through and make sure that we're reading the full question as well. All right. Very real questions. All right. So contracts to buy and sell real estate. The sales contract is a written document entered into by a buyer and a seller to transact real estate. In general, the buyer agrees to pay an agreed upon amount for the property, and in turn, the seller agrees to convey title of the property to the buyer. The typical sales contract is a very detailed and oftentimes a complicated document, as it establishes all the terms and the conditions of the property for sale. All right, so there's the first thing. This is an agreement. So if they're asking you for who the parties between the contract to buy and sell, the parties are the buyer and the seller, not the real estate agent, not the lender. The only parties to the contract to buy and sell are the buyer and the seller. It's going to lay out the responsibilities and the obligations of the buyer and the seller, right? So when we're talking about the contract, the contract's an agreement. It's either to do something or not to do something. Like that's what a contract is. And so in a real estate contract, yeah, there could be some not do things, right? Like And I would think of that more in an agency agreement. It's like, no, I don't want my home listed on the MLS. Like that would be an example of a not to do something. Yet most of the CBS, the contract to buy and sell, that's going to be mostly these are what we are going to do. We also have time is of the essence. Time is of the essence. This is just that all parties need to understand the dates and deadlines are to be strict and absolute. All right. Time is of the essence means that if we put a date down, that's the date. All right. So if we say that everything will be due tomorrow, tomorrow is the day. All right. Now, this is something else. It doesn't mean that we can't do an amendment to the contract, but what this is really pointing to is that we're going to do everything in our power to hit this date and deadline. And yes, life happens. Life gets busy. Life gets messy. We might have to change something. We're allowed to do that as long as both parties agree to it. But we're going into this contract saying that time is of the essence. We put it down. We agreed to it today. We're going to aim to hit those dates. Good faith. A sales contract typically contains a good faith provision whereby both the buyer and the seller acknowledge that they each have an obligation to act in good faith concerning the contract provisions. And it's like this. We're going through and we're saying that if I'm supposed to do something, I'm going to do it. And I'm going to do everything to actually hit what I said that I was going to do. I'm not going to play games. I'm not going to play backhanded on you. Like if we're getting into this contract, I intend to close. All right. That's what good faith is. Like both parties are agreeing to get this thing to the finish line. And again, life happens, things pop up. That's totally okay. Yet we're going into this thing saying that we put dates and deadlines in here. We're going to hit them. That's time is of the essence. And good faith means I want to buy the house and the seller wants to sell the house. Like that's where we're at. We also know this. We have to give recommendation that they seek legal and tax counsel. It's always recommended that all parties to a sales contract understand that the contract has important legal and tax consequences and therefore should consult with legal, tax, or other counsel before entering into the contract. Now, here's the thing. Does it happen? Most of the time it does not, unless it's a special circumstance, but we're still advising that they do it. So much so to where like on the top of our contracts, everyone like it's at the top and it says it and it's like written in the body that we say, hey, there's important tax and legal consequences. And we suggest that you seek advice to people that are way more qualified than me to answer these questions so that you are protected. And then the fundamental provisions of a sales contract in the contract to buy and sell has this. It's going to identify the parties, right? The parties, the buyer and the seller, the description of the property. We know that the property address is not a legal description. It might be a marketing piece. So if you do get a test question and it talks about legal property description, we know it's not 123 Main Street. It is not the address. It is, meets and bounds, lot and block, governmental survey. It could be any of those things, but it's not the address. And it's definitely not the tax number, the tax ID number either. The price and the method of the payment. Like we're going to put in that this is a conventional loan at $600,000, or it's, $450,000 house where we're using a VA loan. So that's going to be spelled out. The date for closing of the property. Remember, we're setting these times and dates that we're going to adhere to. So in the contract to buy and sell, which is a sales contract, we're actually going to list every date that we're doing and how we're going to give title and when possession of the property will happen. Like all of that is going to be in this document. Like literally, this is the playground rules. These are the dates and deadlines that we were trying to hit, and that we're going into this thing with one mission in mind. I'm going to buy it as the buyer, and you're going to sell it as the seller, and we're going to get this thing to the finish line. So as we're looking at this, it says, the date and deadline section of the contract to buy and sell is utilized to, and it's D. It says the date and deadlines chart is the sole location for listing dates in the contract to buy and sell. These dates mandate the completion of each specified element and are not merely suggestions. Remember, time is of the essence. They are binding requirements of the contract. changes to these dates can be made using an amend extend. All right. So I want everyone to know, again, time is of the essence, meaning that we fully intend, but life happens and we can change them. And it's a small change, right? And so when there's a small change, we use an amend extend. That means that it's already in the contract. We're not adding to the contract. We are changing a piece of the contract. That's an amend extend that you would use in that case. I also want you guys to know this. While I don't have this spelled out, I do want you to know this. They're not going to call it like dates and deadlines. They're not going to say that this is the box, right? I think it says the chart, the dates and deadlines chart. They're most likely going to call it contingencies. All right. These are contingency deadlines. So they're not going to call them dates and deadlines. They're going to call them contingencies. So the contingencies have strict time frames that are set around them. The buyer has a financing contingency with a loan objection deadline of April 1. The buyer's lender has just informed her that the appraisal will not be completed until April 15th. In this case, the buyer broker should, and it's B, right? So the buyer broker should prepare an amend extend. All right. So an amend extend, remember small changes, we're going to do an amend extend. And so there's already date and deadline. That's what we're going to do. And the reason why we're doing this is because the buyer will actually lose the right to terminate the contract if the loan is unacceptable, unless the date is extended. So we need to push this date out. And the reason why we need to push this date out is because if we let that date and deadline pass, right, if it's due tomorrow and we're not going to be able to do it by tomorrow, and now it's Friday, then we've let that date and deadline go. And now we have zero right to object. And so if we're looking at this thing, the appraisal, right, we have a contract. The contract says, I'm going to buy this house for $500,000 contingent upon me being able to get financing. And the appraisal is what helps us get financing, right? This is actually what tells the lender how much the home is worth. So if the date goes by and we don't have a appraisal done on the home, that means that we don't have the right to object if the appraisal comes in low. So that's why we would do something like this to amend the contract. Then here we go. Let's talk about the use of standard forms. Through adoption of Commission Rule F, it became compulsory for all real estate brokers licensed by the state of Colorado to use commission-approved forms in most of their contracting. And by most of the contracting, this is what it means. If the state of Colorado wrote us a form that fits, we must use it. We can't go and have a custom form created. We as real estate agents, we can't create our own forms. We're not allowed to do that. That's way above our skill set. That would actually be practice of law. And while we have the limited ability to practice law because of Conway Bogue, this is well beyond that scope. So if CREC, the Colorado Real Estate Commission, has created an approved form, we must use it if that form works for the type of transaction. Now, there's going to be cases where that transaction and the form don't make sense. Lawyer, all right? The lawyer's going to write it up in that case. And the Division of Real Estate, on behalf of the Colorado Real Estate Commission, makes commission-approved forms available to third-party vendors upon request. Licensees are advised that third-party vendors may make commission-approved forms available for use by real estate brokers. Licensees shall continue to be responsible to ensure that any third-party vendor forms used are commission approved. All right. So if you're reading that and you're like, what, really? Absolutely. So you could go out and you could go buy software that has forms on it. And they're like, these are Colorado commission approved forms. And they might not be. Now, here's the thing. Does this happen often? No. But also what's going on for anyone that's paying attention to the NAR settlement and anything else that's happening, like we're getting a bunch of new forms and they're all going into place here very, very soon, which means that if no one's paying attention, they could actually be using expired forms. And that's how something like this would happen. And it doesn't say that the third party vendor is responsible or on the hook or anything. They could give you bad forms, or they might not update the forms. You as the real estate agent are responsible for it. All right. So if you get a test question around this, you're responsible for it. And pretty much that's how everything goes. If you're looking at any of these questions and you're diving into it, real estate agents were guilty until proven innocent. And we are responsible. We're definitely responsible for our parties. You know, any test question that you get that's talking about parties, you're responsible for your party. And we're also responsible for commission approved forms and making sure that if we're using third party software, that they're actually correct. So, commission approved forms. And it says a real estate broker is pretty short test question, but you know, as we're looking at standard and approved forms, and it says D are only allowed to modify certain parts and sections of the contract. And that's very true, guys. Like we're allowed to do fill in the blank contracts. We are allowed to omit certain things out of the contract if they don't fit. But we also know this, that it actually has to say omitted, right? So omitted, non-applicable would be what it would really look like. And so we have the ability to fill in the blank contracts, and we have the ability to add certain language provisions that are for this specific type of transaction. We can't cross stuff out. Like we can't go through and just like make things up. We can't say, you know what, this, I don't like the way this is worded. Let's reword this. Like we can't do any of that. But what we can do is we can add information, right? It says add personal information about the firm. We can add specific provisions like buyer wants the home in a broom swept condition, right? Like they can actually say, you know what, we actually want this house clean when we take it over. Like we're allowed to add stuff like that, but we can't go through and delete the price, right? Like that can't happen. And it says word omitted. So if we're removing something from the contract, it will actually have the ability that it will tell us that we're allowed to remove it first and foremost. And it will actually say omitted, non-applicable. Like it will actually put it there and say this section has been removed as omitted, not applicable to the transaction. Oh. So your second question, as we're looking at this thing, it says brokers entering items into computer generated forms must ensure all additions to any blanks. All right. So we're talking about blanks now. And it's A, in different type and clearly different than the approved type. All right. So when we're doing these fill in the blank contracts, we actually have to make it very distinguishable that we actually filled in the blank here and that this wasn't a commission approved language that was already written. It says commission rules require brokers entering items into an approved form to ensure that all additions are clearly distinguishable from the text of the approved language. Items entered into the blanks do not need to be drafted or approved by an attorney, nor do they need to be approved form from the commission or your employing broker unless specified by brokerage firm's policy, right? Like your brokerage firm could dictate like, hey, send us everything that you're doing. We got to read that over. Your office policy would spell that out. But what this is saying is like, you guys have the right to practice limited law because of Conway Bogue, right? Like fill in the blank contracts, inside of our scope, right? When we're talking about the transaction, like we have the ability to navigate those waters, and we can advise and we can fill in the blank contracts. Like that's one of the biggest power. Like you guys are all going to be associate brokers in the state of Colorado. We hold the highest licensure in the United States. And part of that responsibility means like we could actually go out and write some contracts. And yes, we have some forms to use because if we didn't, we'd be lawyers. And so lawyers made this stuff for us. And now we get to use it to help our clients win. So deeds of trust and promissory notes. And we have a deed of trust and a promissory note are two separate documents that are part of a loan agreement between a lender and a borrower. All right. So if you're going to get some test questions around this, I need you guys to know the difference between the two. So a deed of trust. All right. This is an agreement that outlines what happens if the borrower defaults on the loan. It's secured by real estate and held by a third-party trustee until the loan is paid off. The deed of trust gives the lender recourse to sell the property, take it back, or require accelerated loan payments to protect their investment. All right, cool. So the deed of trust, like we're looking at this thing and it's just saying like what happens. Here's the playground rules. You default. This is how we get our money back as a bank. All right, as a lender. Then we have a promissory note. It says the borrowers promise to repay the lender, which includes interest rate, payment amounts, and terms. The lender holds the promissory note until the loan is paid in full. Promissory notes are legally binding and enforceable, and without one, the loan contract may not be. All right, so we have one that says this. It says, hey, we're going to go through, we're going to pay you back, right? And this is what happens if I don't pay you back. All right, and it's going to say you can foreclose on me. I'll give you back the deed, all that stuff. The second one actually is the repayment schedule. It says, hey, over 30 years, I'm going to pay you X amount of dollars until I pay off what I owe you. So, promissory note, payment schedule, playground rules, deed of trust. What happens if I do not make my payments? All right. So, that's the difference in the two. So your test questions around this. It says a buyer writes an offer. It includes a promissory note. What is true about this note? And it says if the seller agrees to accept a promissory note, it must be converted to good funds before closing. It is the responsibility of the listing broker to collect the funds. The seller is not obligated to accept the note, and the terms for converting the note to good funds are specified within the note itself. All right, so we're going through, and as a listing agent, the listing broker, it's our responsibility to convert those into cash. All right. For the most part, the title company does this, but we know that it's our responsibility. And it'll actually lay out, again, the playground rules for when this note turns into actual money. All right. Your second question, the purpose of a promissory note in a purchase contract is to. And again, like we look at this thing and it is to stand in for earnest money. And a deed of trust secures the promissory note. If a buyer terminates without cause or an outside of the contingency timeline, they are still required to fulfill payment obligations. Remedies for default by the parties are determined by the contract, not the promissory note. All right. So what this is saying is the contract actually stipulates. The contract says, listen, if you default, here are the repercussions. Now, the promissory note, on the other hand, that's really going through and that's establishing like what those repercussions really are. All right. So then we look at this disclosure documents. The disclosure form created by the Colorado Real Estate Commission provides buyers with information about the property's condition and any known issues that could affect its value, safety, or health. The purpose of the disclosure is to encourage transparency between the buyer and the seller and to protect buyers from potential repairs and damages. The broker should never fill out this form for the seller. However, the broker should review the form to make sure it is accurate to the broker's knowledge. All right, so we're looking at this, and so brokerage disclosure. Brokerage disclosure is this. It is saying, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, these are all the things that I know about the property. The roof leaks, the AC unit was replaced last year. Yes, that we have asbestos, right? Like anything that you actually know about the property, but it's your actual knowledge. All right. It's to your actual knowledge of what is going on with the property, not what you think. All right. So you don't put on this, you don't hear a noise up in the attic and you're like, oh, you know what? I think we got squirrels. No, like it's actual knowledge. Like, what do you actually know about the property? And as the real estate agent, you're not filling this out. This is the seller's obligation. Now, if you know the roof leaks, they're going to say, hey, Mr. Seller, Mrs. Seller, like, We talked about this. I was just here the other day and it was raining and the water was dripping from the ceiling onto the dining room table. You need to disclose that. I did cut this out for you guys so you could see this. So it's a seller's property disclosure. On or before seller's property disclosure deadline, seller agrees to deliver to the buyer the most current version of the applicable Colorado Real Estate Commission seller's property disclosure form completed by the seller to the seller's actual and current knowledge as of this date. So, current and actual knowledge completed by the seller. All right. I also want you guys to know this. This isn't a mandatory form. All right. This is not a mandatory form. The seller does not need to give this. That does not give the seller permission to not disclose. They have to disclose any material facts. This form is to help them do that. Now, it is not required for them to do it, but then you have to wonder, like, what might they be hiding if they're not doing this? So, not required form. The seller fills it out to their actual and current knowledge. And so, what I mean by that, when we're talking about actual and current knowledge, let's say this. We live in Colorado. We know we have hail, right? Hail comes through every year. And so we have a house, we go to list the house. Houses are sitting a little bit longer now, right? Like we're in a different environment where houses might sit for 30, 60 days. So we have a contract, we fill out the seller property disclosure, everything's aces. Now, hailstorm blows through. We get an offer like a week later. We know that the hailstorm beat up that roof. Like there is hail marks on that roof. We have to disclose that. All right. So it's actual and current knowledge. So as we're looking at this thing, the purpose of the seller's property disclosure is to, and it's to create a written disclosure of material facts, right? No disclosure completely removes all the liability. And brokers are still required to disclose any material facts that they are aware of. Additionally, this disclosure does not eliminate the necessity for an inspection. All right. So, like, this is not in place of an inspection. Still get an inspection. Don't advise your client to pass on inspection. That's not good. That's how you get your E&O insurance tested. So, as you're looking at this thing, we need to just make sure that they need to look at this. This is going to help them make some decisions. And we're not taking it as gospel. It's just going to, maybe give us a little bit of a map, a little bit of insight of what could or could not be wrong with this property. And then maybe as the buyer, I'm talking to my inspector and I'm saying, hey, the seller said that there was like a leak in the roof. Would you spend a little extra time and tell me what that leak looks like? Let me know if there's mold up there or something. Like, it's going to help with the roadmap. Your second question, a seller has informed the listing broker that he will not complete the approved seller's property disclosure form. The listing broker then receives an offer. What is the seller's next step if he still does not want to complete the form? All right. This is a kind of a trick question, right? Because I just showed you the document, right? On that last slide, I showed you about the seller's property disclosure. Well, if we get an offer that says that there has to be a seller's property disclosure and our seller says, absolutely no way I am giving a seller's property disclosure, what must we do? That's what this is asking us. This is saying, hey, it's saying that you're going to give one. Your seller said it's their right not to give one. The contract, the CBS, contract to buy and sell, stipulates, it says seller will provide. What must happen now? Well, the answer is this. It's A, and it says we got to counter it. We got to counter the buyer. Removing the request from the contract to buy and sell and attach a written disclosure of material facts, right? So we don't have to give this disclosure. We do have to disclose material facts in writing. And it says the seller is not required to use the approved form, but must counter to remove it. Because again, if we sign it, guys, then we're agreeing to it. Anything that we sign, we agree to do this. So we would just counter that one thing. We would just say, listen, we love the price. We love most all the terms. We like the day that you're closing. The only thing we don't like is that you want a seller's property disclosure and we're not going to do it. But here's the thing. Going to let you know like what's wrong with the home. We're just not going to give you that disclosure. So this is how we would do this. It is a counter. So another thing called an addenda. So an addenda to the contract. A real estate addenda in Colorado is a legal document that can be added. All right. So an amendment is a small change, right? We talked about dates and deadlines, right? That's a small change. It's already in the contract. We're gonna change it. An addenda is an addition to the contract to modify or supplement its terms and conditions. Addenda can be added to a contract at any time before the closing date, as long as both parties agree to the changes. All right, so think about that. We have a contract to buy and sell. Both parties have agreed to it. Time is of the essence, good faith. Life happens. All right, life happens. And now, if both parties agree, both the buyer and the seller, we can make changes through an addenda. Now, if one party wants to do it and the other party doesn't, well, then the parties have something to think about. And typically the buyer is the only one that has the right to back out of most anything. So if the seller's like, you know what, I don't want to do this, the contract could still move forward. So as long as both parties agree to the changes, however, an addendum should not be confused with an amendment, which modifies a contract that has already been executed. All right. So we have an amendment is different than an addenda. All right. So we have a contract that's already been signed and we're just changing some things. That's an amendment. We need to add something to a contract. That's an addenda to the contract. All right. And it says this before it closes. We can't go modify anything after the contract closes. There's nothing to modify. The contract's been completed. So be cautious and conscious of that that little nuance. So we're looking at this thing, and for some reason I listed this as D as my question. All of the following are true of the square footage disclosure except. All right, so square footage disclosure. We know this is a marketing tool. This is where we're going through, and the answer is actually D. And so it's the responsibility of both the listing and the buyer broker to measure the property for disclosure, right? So it's accept. Remember, we saw accept there. You're not obligated to measure. All right. Neither the listing or buyer broker are responsible to measure the property. So if you get a question like this, it's not your responsibility. We'll go through all the rest of it's real. We got to deliver it to the buyer in a timely manner. It's used to tell where the square footage came from and how it was determined. And the listing broker selling the buyer signed the form, right? Like that's it. Like those are real, but it's not the listing agent or the buyer's agent responsibility to measure this property. And honestly, there's a piece on there that actually says, if the square footage actually matters to you, go have it independently measured. Like that's pretty much the gist of it. So it's actually the buyer's responsibility. The second thing is this: to add to an addendum to the contract to buy and sell, it must be created and negotiated by which parties? All right. So you're looking at this, guys. Who are the parties to the contract to buy and sell? That's the only thing that's going to be here. So when we're talking about that, it's A, right? It's the buyer and the seller. It says, according to commission rules, only the parties to the contract or an attorney representing one of the parties, right? If we have POA, power of attorney, someone could, be in place and negotiating for you. In the contract to buy and sell, only the seller and the buyer are considered the parties to the contract, therefore are only allowed to add an addenda. And it says brokers can draft the addendum based on the terms that were negotiated between the parties. And so that's very important key point as well. You're not adding things because you're saying, oh, this is how things are always done, or like this is how I always write contracts. No, you're not a party to the contract. You are there to advise. You are there to be a fiduciary, but you're not filling out the contract the way that you want to fill out the contract because that's the way that you've always filled out contracts. No, the parties, the buyer and the sellers dictate the terms, and you are there to put it on paper and to make it happen. All right. So when you see a question like this and they're talking about like who needs to sign, who is the one negotiating, all this stuff, like it's the parties. And so the parties to the contract and buy and sell, this is a sales agreement. Those parties are the buyer and the seller. When they're talking about a listing agreement, it's the agent and the client, and you're going to need to be able to differentiate the two. All right, we got a counter proposal form. Like you're going to get questions around this. And so a counter offer is a rejection of the original offer, and you're simultaneously making a new offer. An important point is that making a counter actually rejects the original offer. A counter offer cannot be made with the intention of accepting the original offer if the counter offer is not accepted. All right. So here it is. I actually screenshot this. This is the counter proposal form that is in Colorado. And you can look at this. It's got the date. It actually says that, like, hey, this one's going to supersede any previous counter proposals and obviously the original proposal. It gives you the known as, right? And it actually insert legal description here. So you actually put all that stuff in there. And it does tell you, says if a table's been omitted or if it's been left blank, then there's no change. All right. So like this is used where you go through and it's going to call out a bunch of stuff on the contract. And we go through and we say, you know what, we don't care about this. Remember in our previous example, they just wanted to remove the seller's property disclosure. So we'd say everything's no change to anything except for this one item. And that's the counter. You can use this counter to change the price. You can use this counter to change contingencies. You can use this counter to change anything in the original offer. Now, you have to keep in mind that if you counter something, that other contract is now gone. You don't get to go back if the other party says, yeah, no, I don't accept your terms. You can't say, okay, well, I'll sign your old contract, your old offer then. Nope, that offer's gone now. All right. So the moment that someone signs the counter proposal, that counter takes the last offer and the offer is void now. And this is the new offer on the table. So if the other party does not accept the new offer, there is no other offer to go back to. All right. So the offerer and the offeree, remember the offerer is the person sending it. Typically that's the buyer, right? The buyer is the offerer and the seller is the offeree. Now, if the seller does not want to go with the current offer, they could counter. Now the seller's the offerer and the buyer's the offeree. And this can keep ping-ponging back and forth, back and forth. Also keep in mind this, the seller only signs the contract that they're comfortable with. So they get an offer that they want to counter. They don't sign the original offer. They sign the original offer. We have offer and acceptance, right? We got offer and acceptance because we got two signatures on there. So as the party that wants to counter, you do not sign the offer that you want to counter. You sign the counter proposal. And then when the other party signs the counter proposal, now we have offer and acceptance. So your questions, a listing broker is preparing a counter proposal that changes the price and the earnest money. The seller also requested the listing broker to move the closing date from 90 days after acceptance to 60. But the broker failed to include this change. The buyer accepted the counter proposal. What is the status of the closing date? Okay, cool. So we did the first two things. Our client told us to do three things. We did two of the three. Counter. Both parties signed. Offer and acceptance. What's going on now? Well, it's the same date as the original contract. All right. So we didn't get acceptance on that. While we were instructed to do it, we failed to do it. And the counter proposal terminates the original contract, and any items not addressed in the counter carry over from the new agreement. So the old agreement, 90 days, that's what's in play, not the 60 that the client wanted. Since the closing date was not changed in the counter, the contract will proceed with the original closing date of 90 days. Your second question, the seller has given the buyer a counter proposal, which the listing broker attached to the contract to buy and sell and sent the buyer's broker and buyer, right? So they sent it over. What does this mean? And as we're looking at this thing, it says, well, the original offer, it's D, is terminated, right? We know that as soon as we write a counter, the original offer is now off the table. It is gone. The seller signs the counter proposal. The original contract does not get signed. You do not sign the offer that you are countering. I can almost guarantee you that's a test question. The counter proposal is attached to the original offer because any terms not altered in this counter proposal will carry forward. Now, this is kind of written kind of funny because in the grand scheme of things, we do everything electronically. We're not stapling things together and handing it over. I mean, there are some parts of Colorado that still do that. I've done wet signatures where we're actually handing paper and it's super archaic, but it still happens every once in a while. So picture this in your head, but this isn't truly how we do business. All right, we got closing instructions. The closing instructions serve to engage the closing company with the parties of their real estate transaction. All right. The closing company agrees to provide settlement services in connection with a transaction for the sale and purchase of a property. The parties who engage are the buyers and the sellers. The documentation authorizes the closing company to obtain information necessary for closing. The closing company, in turn, agrees to prepare and deliver and record all documents, excluding legal documents, necessary to close the transaction. All right. So this is kind of loaded a little bit. And the closing instructions is the playground rules between the buyer, the seller, and the closing company. All right. Buyer, seller, closing company. Those are the parties to this. So when you're talking about this is what you're thinking about. Now, when we're looking at this thing, we have a test question. And let's look at this test question. To hire the title company as a scrivener using the closing instructions, the parties are. All right. So this is where it gets interesting. I just told you that the parties are the buyer, the seller, the closing company. Well, the person that hires the company as a scrivener is a little bit different. And that's typically the listing broker. So we as listing brokers are hiring the title company to actually be the person that like writes everything for us. And we're the person. All right. So we hire the scrivener. The scrivener is just a writer. That's all I want you to think about. The scrivener person that's a scribe, they're writing, they're putting together documentation for us. But the actual parties to that agreement are the buyer, the seller, and the title company. But a scrivener is someone who writes a document, such as a deed in this case, for another party in return for a fee. So there is a fee associated with this. The listing broker is the one that typically pays it. The main purpose of the approved closing instructions form is to what? And we just talked about is to allow the seller and the buyer to hire the closing company, right? It's D. The second use of this form is for the listing broker to hire the closing company as a scrivener, like we just talked about that, and responsible for completing the legal documentation, right? So that's all what we're doing. We're hiring them. That's the second thing. We hire them to do all the documentation, and the parties to this form, buyer, seller, closing company. Seller financing. All right. So we got three different ones in here. And I think it's just important to kind of just know these. I'm not going to go with you guys and talk about FHA, VA, conventional, like we got that. But let's talk about seller financing. And so here are three ones that I think that two, and then what seller financing is. But we have a wrap. All right. So a wraparound mortgage. The buyer becomes the owner of the property, but makes payments to the seller so that the seller can continue to make payments on their existing loan. All right. So what this looks like is I got a mortgage, a loan. I have a loan for, let's say, that I have to pay $3,000 a month to the mortgage company. Well, so then I go through and in a wrap, what I would probably do is say, hey, buyer, just pay me directly. You owe me $3,300 a month. And we make a deal and cool, like we make that deal. So then the month rolls around, I get $3,300 from the buyer, and I pay the $3,000 to the mortgage company, and I pocket $300. That's a wrap. So I mean, grand scheme of things, that's what that is. Then we have an installment land contract. So an ILC, installment land contract, is an agreement where the buyer actually takes possession. All right. So they actually take possession, but not ownership of the property, and makes periodic payments to the seller. During that time, the buyer is making the payments. The seller continues to own the property. After the final installment payment, the deed to the property will be transferred to the buyer. All right. So, guys, this is in here because this is a big deal, especially with the interest rates and the current environment that we are in. People look for this creative financing. That's what I think of this as. This is creative financing. So, with creative financing, there's a risk. There's a lot of risk for here. And if you've seen this and you're like, okay, cool. So, the buyer's making payments in this installment land contract and yet doesn't own any paperwork saying that they own the house, even though they're the ones making the payments. You guys see the risk here, right? Like you're going through here, like, this doesn't sound good. Well, that's what our job comes into play is that we're like, so Mr. Mrs. Seller, this is the risks to this. Like, I'm not an attorney. You probably want to talk to an attorney, and there's probably legal and tax implications. Yet, these are my thoughts on this. So, seller financing allows the seller to act as the lender and the buyer obtains satisfactory financing from the seller. When the seller financing is involved in a transaction, both the buyer and the seller should consult separate legal counsels. And absolutely. And guys, like this is one of those things where we're actually not really even allowed to touch some of these. And there's other ones that are like, we're really not allowed to touch these to where like we could lose our license for being a part of some of this stuff. But an installment land contract, if you do get a test question around this isn't you, this is for a lawyer. Lawyers do this. We're not doing it. We're not doing an installment land contract. This is contact an attorney, have the attorneys write this up because we don't even have a contract for this. A wraparound mortgage. The issue with a wraparound mortgage is it's probably going against your promissory note, right? And so you're probably actually it's probably what is called an alienation clause, right? It says if you leave the property, then we're going to accelerate and you owe us all the money. Well, technically you left the house. You left the house. There's someone else living in the house. Yeah, you're making your monthly payment, but we want all of our money today. See, look, there's a risk. There's inherited risk. And we see this stuff pop up with interest rates being what they are, and people try to get creative. And so these are some of the test questions that you potentially could see around this. And what type of market might a seller achieve a faster sale by offering seller financing? All right. So the market that we're in, right? The market that we are in today, and it's a slower market with high interest rates. When the market slows and interest rates are high, fewer buyers can qualify for a loan. Guys, we live in Colorado. We have one of the highest price points in the United States. And so with interest rates being what they are, there's less qualified buyers out there. And so people try to figure out like ways that they can make deals work. And that's where we fall into some of this stuff. A seller offering a lower interest rate and easier qualification terms would have an advantage in this type of market, potentially leading to a faster sale. So there's right ways and there's wrong ways to do this, but just think about that, right? So you're going through, and let's say that you have a home where you're at a 2 or 3% interest rate, and interest rates, right now, let's call them 7%. So if an interest rate's at 7% and you have a home that's at 2 or 3%, you can offer someone like, I don't know, 3, 4, 5%. Like that's a way better deal. And so then they're making the payments to you. You're making your monthly payment as the seller to the person that holds your loan. And then you're putting some extra money in your pocket, and the buyer's winning because the buyer does not have to go at that 7%. Like they're still winning, even though that they have a higher interest rate than what you did. Your next question, all the following are advantages of seller financing except. And it's a shorter term, right? Like in the grand scheme of things, if we're talking about a $600,000 home, it doesn't mean that we're going to do this in 5 years, right? Like there's nothing that is going to be able to get this thing done any quicker. So seller financing provides several advantages, including potentially a lower interest rate, easier qualifications, and no closing fees, right? You're not going to charge probably any fees that are associated with you actually closing on the loan. The disadvantage is it often comes with a shorter term compared to traditional financing. So like you're looking at this thing, it's the shorter term. Like that is not one of the advantages. Like it actually could potentially be longer in the grand scheme of things. It's typically not shorter because we're still dealing with a lot of money over time. And you're not going to see anyone be able to pay $600,000 in like a 15-year span versus a 30-year. So again, like as we're looking at this thing and we're diving into it, this section Colorado forms and contracts. It's 23 items. And those are literally them. Everything that we just touched, listing contracts. We talked the contract to buy and sell, standard forms, promissory note versus deed of trust, disclosure documents, the addenda versus addendum, right? Or versus amendment, the counter proposal, close instructions, seller financing. That is 74. That's 74 questions on your test. And 23 of them are in this one topic alone. So if I'm doing some cram session, if I'm like, you know what, on this, what should be like the biggest section that I'm studying? This is it, right? This is 1/3 of your exam. And this is where I'm going to put a lot of my focus when it comes to studying for the Colorado real estate exam.